Welcome to The Drummer's Pathway, the podcast about music, life, and the creative process. Hello, I'm Michael Scott, and welcome to the Drummer's Pathway podcast, where we explore the personal and professional journeys of drummers, educators, and artists who've committed their lives to creativity and the arts. For this episode, I welcome back Tim Carman for his second appearance on the podcast. Tim recently relocated to Nashville, where he continues to be an in-demand touring and session musician and band leader. He is also a member of the bands Parlor Greens and Canyon Lights. As an educator, he is the author of 5 books, including the highly regarded Haynes-ISM and Philly-ISM methods. His forthcoming book is entitled The Shuffle Book, The Language, Lineage, and Art of Shuffle Drumming, which is the first volume of this series. In this episode, we talk about his recent move to Nashville, explore the key concepts from his upcoming shuffle book, and why it's crucial to play with other musicians to develop your creative confidence. And now, let's get started with my conversation with Tim Carman. To begin, I just want to say how much of a pleasure it is for me to get a chance to connect with you again. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation last year, and I know there's been a lot in your life that has changed as of late, including a move to Nashville, which we're going to get into. And one of the focuses that I want to get into today is the discussion of your upcoming book, The Shuffle Book. So I'm really excited to see how that came about and really get into the concept. So the last time we talked, you weren't living in Nashville. So you have recently made the move to Nashville. So what brought that on?
Kind of a lot of life events, to be honest with you. I think a couple of years ago, to be candid, I went through a divorce. And at that point in my life, I've been living in Boston for some years, and I wanted to try some things out. And I had some buddies out in Denver, Colorado, who, kind of welcomed me out there. So I gave that a shot for a year and enjoyed it. And then another friend of mine named AJ Fullerton, who's actually from Colorado, he bought a house in Nashville. And he hit me up. He's like, I got an extra room. We're going to build a studio in the house. Come on out. So I've been out here about 8 months now. And it's been great. I love it so far.
So you spent a lot of time in the Boston area, and you were really involved in that particular scene. So how has you found the dynamic shift now going to Nashville, which has its own scene there?
Yeah, I feel fortunate that I met a lot of people on the road who lived in Nashville before moving here. So when I did finally settle down here, I feel like, I know some people well. And the community here is pretty incredible. It's really warm. It's welcoming. There's not a lot of attitude that I've seen, which has been really refreshing. So, yeah, I feel like it's my spot. I definitely think I'm going to settle down here and work on, meeting more people and breaking into the community. And, there's so many talented musicians here. And so many great people. So I think it's just a fantastic city to be in. And also a lot of people just assume it's just country music or just, but there's so much going on. And in the blues world, obviously the singer-songwriter, jazz, there's some just killer players in every style of music here. So.
One of the things that I have found, because I've interviewed a lot of people from Nashville, is it's very much a community of support.
Totally.
And, as you said, when you go to certain places, there's an aspect of competition in everything that you do in the music scene. But when you have a community that's rallying around you to support you, open up opportunities, because sometimes an opportunity that's available to someone else, they're not available for. And when you start to develop the community, they're much happier just to kind of pass your name around and give you opportunities. And people like to share experiences. And so one of the things that I found talking to people in Nashville is that there's a strong desire to share experiences and to mentor and
Totally.
support people. And so despite the fact it's a community that people go to try and break into, it's one from the drummer standpoint that can be incredibly welcoming. And as you said, it's not strictly country. There's many different aspects that may not get as well known as some of the other ones, but I can see you who are coming into this scene with the right attitude and the right experience doing very well. So I'm very pleased to see how well you've adjusted to the community. And I look forward to seeing what it does for you.
Yeah, likewise. I definitely feel fortunate. And it's, thinking about it more too, I do see a lot of parallels between Nashville and Boston, because I also felt in Boston that the music community is really tight knit and supportive there. And I've made some incredible, musical connections in that area as well. And Nashville, surprisingly is a lot smaller than I realized before moving here. But I love that about it. Yeah, there's so many venues around though to play. But like you go anywhere, you're going to run into somebody, and depends on who you talk to. Some people don't like that, but for me, I think it's great. I like running into familiar faces and creating, the good tight community with new friends, and it's great.
People often talk about the concept of networking, and I think networking can be a bad word because people misunderstand what the fundamentals of successful networking actually is. And it's about building relationships, not just trying to go out and tell everyone why you are the person that should be hired for all of these scenarios because of your skill set. It's just about genuine community. And when you build community, the opportunities suddenly start to open up because people want to hire and work with people that they like. It's not just a level of musicianship. So, the expectation is that if you're cool and they like you, they assume that you can already cut the gig. And those are how you get these different opportunities.
Yeah, the drum community in particular out here is awesome. And I went out to this place called Dee's Lounge, which is like in East Nashville the other night with a friend of mine who's a non-musician, but he's a good buddy. And he was joking because like 10 minutes into me being there, it was just like me and like 3 other drummers in like a corner just hanging out talking drum stuff. And, and he was like, okay, I see it's a little drummer corner now. And he's like, I'm going to go do my thing. But yeah, there's a great community of drummers and musicians.
As a musician and an educator, you are highly regarded for your skill set in terms of blues and groove and music along that particular style. And the last time we talked, we really got deep into your isms books that are out with Hudson Music, the Haynes-ISM and the Philly-ISM book, which I think, for me, are exceptional references in terms of building your creative style and getting outside of your comfort zone in a way that allows you to adapt and embrace the history that came before, but in a way that you can make it your own. And you and I have had that conversation. So I'm really intrigued about your forthcoming book that will be coming out on Hudson Music. I believe it's coming out in June.
That's the goal.
So your forthcoming book is The Shuffle Book, The Language, Lineage, and the Art of Shuffle Drumming, which is almost an encyclopedia type of guide in terms of the concept of shuffles, the icons of that music, the areas and things, because it's very regional based, where you can learn something that is a particular style, but depending on what city you're in, everything has its own take. So this particular book gets into the shuffle styles of New Orleans, Chicago, Texas, Mississippi, and Memphis. And I had a chance to read through the reference that you had sent me, and I was blown away by the wealth and depth of information and study of this. And I think this, to me, is going to be an essential book, and it's something that I can't wait to really jump into. So where did the inspiration for this originally start?
Well, if shuffles for me, it's kind of like shuffles are my bread and butter groove, and I have a deep love of blues music and shuffle-based music and swing music. And when I was playing in the project GA20, which is a Boston-based blues, largely like inspired by Chicago, early Chicago recordings, I dove pretty deeply into the Chicago shuffle when I was in that group. And since then, I've branched out, and I've just always been curious about the history of shuffles, and the nuances. And I truly believe it's a really subtle art form that a lot of people kind of oversimplify and think it's, it's just a shuffle. Like, I've heard that plenty of times. People say that, but there's so many nuances to the groove. And I just personally really wanted to dive into that a little more. So this was a fun journey, a fun study of a style of drumming that is near and dear to my heart. So I really had a great time digging into this, and it was a long process. It took me a long time to do this book, but I had a great time. So,
well, the book's 200 pages long.
It was going to be one book too, but now it's a 2-volume series now. So this is the first volume, and the second volume is going to dive more into, Los Angeles studio musicians and New York musicians and stuff like that. So.
Now, in terms of the regional aspect of the book, as I said, because it covers the stylistic elements that are characteristic in New Orleans, Chicago, Texas, Mississippi, and Memphis. As you said, it's one of those things that people often consider well, it's just a shuffle, so play a shuffle. But the wrong shuffle in a certain context will completely take the characteristics of the intention away of the music. And so what I like is that it references history. It references icons in this particular genre and why certain things are the way that they are. Very similar going back a couple of decades in terms of Zorro and Daniel Glass putting out the encyclopedia of R&B drumming, where they get into the history and all of the different styles. And so I found this book very similar to that. But even though you're discovering some of the key elements in terms of the regional aspects of this, there's a lot of stuff still to get into. And so, as you said, this is going to be a 2-volume series. But when you get into the second volume, which is getting into like the LA drummers and some of the other icons, a lot of that is going to then be referenced back to the history. Because when you get into Jeff Porcaro and you get into Bernard Purdy and all of these icons, which I'm sure you're going to reference in volume 2, everything that they play, they reference back to what you're covering in the first volume. So was this something that you were already well familiar with, or is this something as you did your research, you really started to see what some of the fundamental differences were between the regions?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely was well-versed in Chicago shuffle drumming, and I had a good idea about Texas and Memphis as well. But, one of the major questions that you always get as a drummer is, what's the difference between a Chicago shuffle and a Texas shuffle? And that was kind of one of the main things that I wanted to tackle when writing this book. And I reached out to, friends who are a little older and more well-versed, like Jay Moeller. He lives down in Texas. He's a great Texas shuffle drummer. And June Core, he's played with Charlie Musselwhite for a few decades, and it comes from the Chicago style of things. So I got to interview some great drummers, and I did a lot of listening, talking about, the difference between Texas shuffles and Chicago shuffles. As a drummer, that's, something that occurs a lot. You're playing a gig with blues musicians, and they'll say, this is a Texas shuffle, this is a Chicago shuffle. So I wanted to dig into that a little bit more. And I think a good place to start is just in Chicago and how that shuffle vocabulary came about in the 1940s and 50s. A lot of those early drummers who really invented that style of playing, like Fred Below and Odie Payne Jr. and Earl Phillips, Francis Clay, they were jazz drummers for the most part. And a lot of them studied jazz at the Roy Knapp School in Chicago. And when they got out of school, they were looking for jazz gigs, but blues was erupting in that period of time because of the electrification of the guitar. So the main gigs that were coming up were blues gigs and Odie Payne and Fred Below were working at studios like Chess Records, and they took their sort of loose jazz improvisatory approach and transferred that into the blues world. And they really set the foundation for what we know as Chicago shuffle drumming, but in my opinion, just in general, like shuffle drumming. And one of the main grooves that was played was the Chicago double shuffle, which is where both hands play in unison the shuffle pattern, which you could count 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and a lot of times that shuffle pattern would have, maybe a solid backbeat on 2 and 4, but interestingly, plenty of times also drummers like Fred Bilo would play that shuffle. I would call it an open double shuffle where there's no accent on 2 and 4. And they would respond to the music almost like a big band drummer might, where they'd accent, they'd respond to a soloist with dropping bombs with their bass drum or accents on the snare, like syncopated accents. So in that sense, there's a strong jazz foundation in the Chicago style of drumming. And also, if we want to talk about subdivision and where the groove is leaning in terms of the triplet note, a lot of those drummers had a kind of a rounder, swing style, where they were playing pretty much on the grid a lot of times of a triplet, or sometimes even straightening it out slightly for like the early rock and roll Chuck Berry stuff. Now, if you move down to Texas, in my opinion, and I talked to drummer Jay Moeller, who's based down there, he was saying that kind of the architect of the Texas rub shuffle, which is I'll talk about, was created by this drummer Herbert Henderson, who played with Albert Collins on like Frosty. And one of the main elements of that style of shuffle drumming is the rub that Herbert Henderson played on the snare drum, which was kind of like a little buzz note on the and after the backbeat. So like 1 and 2, he would dig his stick into the drum there and create what people sometimes call a Texas rub. So the Texas rub shuffle is distinctly unique to Texas. At least back then. I mean, people all over the place use it now, but there weren't really Chicago drummers that I know of, at least, who were doing that type of thing. So there's that element of it. A lot of times, too, those Texas drummers like Herbert Henderson would play quarter notes on the ride. And they had a lot tighter of a shuffle in the sense that it was leaning more towards almost like the 16th note subdivision rather than like a rounded triplet. And again, these aren't like set rules. This is just, obviously there are certain drummers who broke away and did different things, but I think those are distinctly unique aspects of Texas drumming.
Along that lines, because I've played a lot of blues gigs throughout the years, and then, one of the standard things that often comes up is playing a lot of Stevie Ray Vaughan and things along that lines. Yep. And when you get into Chris Layton, it's very much quarter note based. And I think that's what a lot of people get wrong is they automatically go, oh, well, it's a blues shuffle, so you play a blues shuffle, but then it loses the depth of the groove because it's got to have that quarter note element with that sort of lazy sort of drag along that side to create this sort of swampy vibe. And the thing that's cool about it is that there's a rhythmic tension in the things that he's playing. It's not really laid back. It's pushing, but there's an element that's pulling a little back, which makes it just really, really deep. And I find if you don't play it with that quarter note pulse, it feels empty. And I think that's one of the things that is so valuable about really understanding the different regional aspects of this. And going into some of the history, when you listen to a lot of really early blues music, the recordings aren't very good. So a lot of times what you have to find is that you have to really pay attention to get the intention of what it is that they're doing, because you can't hear exactly what they're playing. And then in your book, as you're looking at these different examples, it becomes very obvious as to what they're doing, which shows that you really put the depth into that, because it's really easy just for people to kind of fluff it off and go, oh, well, it's just a shuffle. And then it just doesn't feel right.
Yeah, it takes a lot of careful listening. You got to listen intently and deeply just to really hear what's happening. And totally, as you mentioned, the quality of the recordings at that time, also influenced how each drummer was playing. So it's and I'm very grateful to drummers like June Core and Jay Moeller, that were interviewed and discussed these aspects with them. And Jay Moeller was really the one who hit home for me, that Texas rub shuffle, and pointed me in the direction of checking out those recordings. And you have to listen carefully to hear that rub on the snare drum, but it's distinctly there, and it's totally a unique and significant part of that style of drumming.
Now, you also reference New Orleans, which has its own vibe in all of the different sort of cultural melting pots of music from there. So how would you describe shuffles from a New Orleans standpoint?
A lot of the stuff that was happening in New Orleans was, definitely leaning into being in the cracks between straight and swung. Mm-hmm. You have Earl Palmer, obviously, was, a staple of that period. Another interesting thing or style that I was unaware of until I really dug into this book was this feel called the stroll, which is a shuffle essentially where you play all of the eighth note triplets, usually on the ride. And Earl Palmer did this quite a bit. So on the ride, it'd be like 1 enda, 2 enda, 3 enda, 4 enda. And that was a groove that I had been asked to play. And I played plenty of like early New Orleans type feels. And that was what the person would explain to me to play, but I didn't know what it was called. So it was interesting to dig into that history a little bit and learn about that style. And I would say that's a pretty New Orleans centered style of playing that then made its way up to Chicago, and you would hear, drummers like Odie Payne playing with Magic Sam doing that type of a pattern, but they embellish it with, lots of fills and rolls and interactions. So it's cool to see the groove travel, and then see what happens when it goes to a different city and someone puts their spin on it.
One of the things I always find interesting about these types of projects is that when you just look at the way that the grooves are written out, they seem very simplistic. And so sometimes people will look at it and go, well, this is really easy. I don't have to put the time into this. But it's not just about reading the notes on the page. It's about investing the time into understanding the context. And I think in a lot of musical applications, people don't understand the context because they assume that the fundamentals are so simple that they don't have to really invest the time into there. And it's really easy to overplay because the tendency is, hey, there's a lot of space here, so I can fill the space. But now you're disrespecting the value of why these grooves are so essential in the first place. And one of the tripping points in a lot of cases for these grooves is the hi-hat, because the hi-hat becomes the anchor in many ways that allows the rest of the things to fall into place. And if you take that hi-hat component out, which isn't always on the straight quarter note, it completely changes the vibe, and it makes things uncomfortable if you're not willing to respect the simplicity and put the time in. So I love working through stuff like this and really going through the fundamentals with a better understanding as to the context, because there are many educational options out there that just teach you the grooves, but they don't tell you the why. And you need to understand the why. And I think that's something in here, like, as I said, that I think you've done exceptionally well.
Oh, thank you.
And I found for me, I never really was a big fan of early blues music, but part of it is, once again, getting into the recordings, and they're all standards that you've played for so long that everyone kind of knows. And so everyone's kind of half-assing their way through things.
Totally.
And I find when you're working with musicians that take the time to really learn the context and the fundamentals, it suddenly makes things that you're usually ready just to brush off musically something that suddenly is joyful to play. And so I really think there's a lot of value in going back and really learning why this music is supposed to be a certain way. I've often said, if you listen to James Brown and you play James Brown songs and you change your parts, it's wrong. because everything is a puzzle, and everyone has to play their piece and respect the simplicity of their piece, because it fits together like a collective puzzle, which makes everything that much more powerful. But if you don't respect the components, then it just gets in the way. And I think the thing with blues music is that too many times people are waiting for their moment to do their thing without respecting the fundamentals.
Yeah, and respecting the space. Yeah, the respect, as you had said, which is such a key and difficult thing to do, to embrace that space. Yeah.
As I've matured as a player, I've often found that space in music is music. And that's where the time and the feel comes into play. Whereas many people who are early on in their musical journey find space uncomfortable. And so I think this book is going to be a wealth of information that's really going to help enlighten people to really learn this art form. So we've talked about New Orleans, Chicago, and Texas. Tell me a little bit about the stylistic aspects in terms of Mississippi and Memphis.
Well, Mississippi is interesting because a lot of that style of drumming comes from like drum and fife music, it's called. North Mississippi in particular, that's where the hill country musicians were coming out of. So you had Junior Kimbrough, and the drumming out there was also pretty loose and improvisatory in the sense that drummers were constantly interacting with the musicians that they're playing with. They were dropping, cymbal accents on 2 and 4, some really interesting hi-hat opening patterns in that style of music. And a lot of it was kind of based on something called like a 2-beat feel, which essentially is like bass drum on 1 and 3, snare on 2 and 4. So yeah, that was an interesting style to dig into. I talked to Cody Dickinson quite a bit about hill country drumming. He plays with the North Mississippi All-Stars, fantastic drummer and person. So I definitely have a lot to thank from him for the knowledge on that. So that section was cool to dig into because I had played hill country, but studying the roots of that was quite interesting. So one of my favorite drummers of all time is Jabo Starks. So a large portion of the Memphis section is based off of his playing with Bobby Blue Bland, and talking about his kind of like gospel infused shuffle drumming. So I definitely went down the rabbit hole with him, transcribing his feel, which in some ways was similar to some of the Texas drummers because he had a pretty tight shuffle. He would play a swing pattern on the ride quite a bit. And then he also used a lot of interesting 16th note triplet rolls and fills between the snare and the toms. On a song like Poverty by Bobby Blue Bland, that was one of the ones that I transcribed, and that's one of my favorite shuffle recordings. And I just think he was, one of the most swinging shuffle drummers of all time. And a lot of people look at his period, in James Brown's group, but what he did with Bobby Blue Bland was, some incredible stuff. So I focus on him. I talk a lot about Stax and High Records and Al Jackson Jr. and Howard Grimes as well. It was interesting chatting with a friend of mine, Danny Banks, who lives in Memphis and knew Howard Grimes towards the end of his life. And Howard Grimes had a very distinct shuffle, which Danny and I discussed it, and we had no one had ever put a name to it. So I called it the Howard Grimes stroll shuffle, which I talked about the stroll a little earlier. That's when you're playing like steady 8th note triplets on the ride cymbal. Howard Grimes would do that on the hi-hat. And you can hear a lot of that type of drumming on his playing with Al Green and all sorts of different Stax and High Records musicians. And that's just a super unique, dry, driving shuffle. And a lot of times what he would do is he would omit the backbeat on 2. So maybe he would just play the backbeat on 2, but not play it on 4 for like the verse of the song. And then when the chorus jumps in, he puts in both backbeats, and then all of a sudden dynamically the song takes a shift, up another level. And it's also interesting that style of drumming, story goes, was kind of started because during a session with guitarist Steve Cropper, like was hearing this type of pattern in his head and sang it to Howard Grimes and was like, I want you to try to play this on it. And then Howard, hearing that, it took him a little bit, but he like messed around and figured it out. And that was, that was the first time he played that. So.
Another thing that I think makes a book like this so invaluable is because, as I said, it teaches so many different contexts of shuffles. And you, as a working musician who have worked in many different applications with many different types of musicians, understand that the word shuffle can loosely be used to describe a whole bunch of different types of feels that often aren't even shuffles in the first place, particularly when you get into like, some country stuff and like, oh, this is like a shuffle. Well, it's actually like a train beat, which isn't necessarily traditionally a shuffle. And so the more you understand about context and music, the easier it is for you to get the intention, and so I always say to musicians, be well versed in artists and different styles, whether you love them or not, because the artist that you're working for can't explain to you from a technical standpoint what it is that they want you to do. They're going to reference something. So if they say, hey, I want you to play a shuffle, you can respond with, give me an example of the style of shuffle that you're looking for. And then they'll name a song. And then you go, oh, well, that's not a shuffle. But now I understand what their intention is. And so it's important to be well versed, because a lot of things, and even in this book, some of the shuffles that you reference aren't necessarily truly classified as shuffles, but they would fit into the applications where someone could call it as that.
Yeah, they fall under the umbrella for sure. Like, as you said, a train beat, a train beat is not necessarily a shuffle. I mean, you can swing it and you can shuffle a train beat, and that does happen sometimes. But usually when someone says a train beat, that's not it's not a shuffle. But it is, I mean, I do think, like, as you mentioned, the context is just so key. I mean, one of my favorite drummers is Ted Harvey, who's a Chicago guy. I know we talked about Chicago a little bit already, but I mean, he played with Hound Dog Taylor. And if you're playing with somebody and they call a Hound Dog Taylor song and you haven't heard Ted Harvey's style of playing, which is so unique, and his looseness on the ride cymbal, he does these things, or did these things called cymbal flutters that no one else used. And I, to this day, have not really heard anybody do that. Just playing in his wild style underneath that music fits. It's like you mentioned earlier, putting the puzzle together. It's part of the piece of the puzzle. And I think in order to do the music justice, it's key to know the history and the players who are playing it. Unless obviously you're trying to put your own spin or interpretation on it. That's a different thing. But if you're trying to stay true to the original style, then just knowing who these people are is super important.
Another thing that I really like about this book too is that there's sections in it that really get into fills and how to kind of end the phrasing in terms of shuffles, because as a, someone who is developing as a musician, I often sometimes joke that when I teach younger students, they have a perception that there's a groove and then there is a fill. So you play the groove and then you play the fill, but they don't understand that it all fits together within a context. And so I think sometimes with shuffles, particularly faster tempo shuffles, it's essential that the fill is simplistic and locks within the actual groove, because many times people are looking to do something that's really, really fancy to capture attention, and you can capture attention by not pulling off what it was that you were trying to do in the first place. And so there's value in simplicity, but understanding how it fits within the context of the groove is something that you've laid out beautifully in this book that I know for me, I'm getting tremendous value from.
Yeah, for sure. And I one thing that I do hear when I listen to a lot of drummers who are playing maybe like a traditional style of blues music, but they're not as well versed in it, is, you can hear them do a fill that sounds like, someone would do in 2026. And, and it doesn't quite fit with that. And there's, again, nothing wrong with that. But I think it's like, it's good to at least know and be aware of the types of fills like Odie Payne and Fred Belo and Jabo, as I mentioned, were playing back then, and what was appropriate and what isn't really appropriate in those situations. And you hit the nail on the head, where like the most important thing too is feel, and you cannot sacrifice feel when you run into do a crazy fill or something. You need to make sure that the time and the feel is always there, which is why a lot of shuffle fills are like unison triplets.
Yes.
Between like, that's, you can't go wrong ever doing a unison triplet fill while you're playing a shuffle.
And the other thing I also think that you've outlined beautifully in this book is the dynamic intentions of the grooves, because many times when people see a list of different types of styles, the thing that's neglected is the dynamics and what the intentions are, which adds color and sort of characterizes what the intention for this feel is, because you can read the notes, but if you don't listen to the music or really see it in what the context is, it doesn't feel right. And when something doesn't feel right, it becomes not fun to play, which is one of the things I've often found is that there's many drummers that don't like playing shuffles because they haven't invested the time into making it comfortable. Right? Yes,
exactly. Totally. I'm glad you brought up the dynamics too, because that is one thing that took me the most time when I was doing this, was especially like in the snare drum playing.
Yes.
Like it was like kind of painful to, is it a ghost note? Is it an unaccented note? Is it an accented backbeat? Because there's so much nuance in the snare drumming. I mean, across the board in shuffles, but especially in what the left hand is doing. And that really differentiates the regions and the types of shuffles. So I spent a lot of time listening closely to and trying to notate as specifically as I could the dynamics, like especially in the snare drum parts of each shuffle.
Yeah, and I think you did an exceptional job of that.
Thank you.
You've covered all of these different styles of shuffles and the regional aspects of them. What are some of your favorites to play?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, I love playing a Chicago double shuffle. That's one of my favorite grooves of all time to play. And then I love putting, throwing in some Fred Belo isms within that style, or some Ted Harvey cymbal flutters. Odie Payne, another one of my favorite guys, had very specific fill style that he used that I like to do in a double shuffle as well. And then one of my all-time favorite, songwriters and musicians is Jimmy Reed, who's also a Chicago guy, and his drummer Earl Phillips, his specific style of shuffling on the hi-hat, especially with these interesting hi-hat openings, is also another favorite thing of mine to do. Another shuffle that I haven't really discussed yet here, the flat tire shuffle, which is kind of a Texas-based thing, is also fun to play. But I'm a lover of all shuffles. I love just swinging. The Art Blakey shuffle, which I'm going to be discussing in the next volume, is another favorite of mine to play. But basically everything that falls under the umbrella of shuffles, I'm all in for. So.
Now, when you're learning these sorts of things, what is your personal approach to learning something so that you can really get into the nitty-gritty of it and make it comfortable?
Yeah, well, I mean, number one key is to listen. Like all of these examples that I've discussed, I put in song examples. So first step is to go listen, go check out the recording. Even before you play anything, just listen. And then listen and play along with it and try to match the nuances that are occurring in the subdivision. I'd say that's step 2. So just playing along with it. And then step 3, and I can't harp on this enough, is to play these songs with other people, and hopefully play them with other people who are also knowledgeable of the style of music, so you can try to be as true to it as possible. And another thing that I talk about a lot that's insanely important is just recording or videoing yourself playing these, and then listen back, and then be a critic and see if it feels the way it felt while you were playing it when you listen back to it, and if it fits the style.
which can be a very humbling experience when you first start doing that, because you listen back to going, this felt great, but why is the recording so bad? And it's like, well, that's really when you start to discover the power of dynamics and why you need to adjust these things, because as a player, you're not playing things in the same way that the listener is receiving what it is that you're giving them. And so I think it's important not just to, humble you or to discourage you, but to empower you to go back and to get better. I remember years ago, I went to a clinic given by, the amazing educator, Benny Greb. And he said one of the things that was essential is that you record yourself, but you have to listen to the entire thing. And before you are critical of anything that you do, you have to find 3 things that you really liked that you did.
I love that.
Then once you start to see the positive in the things that you do, you can start to get into the other things that need some work. He said, but most people will record things and then just there's something in it that throws them off and they won't invest the time. So you never really hear the things that you actually have accomplished. You only hear the things that you feel that you haven't. And usually you're very close to getting there. You just need to make a couple of subtle little things. And so for me, over the last few years, I spent a lot of time doing that. And it's all about listening. I think that's the other thing too, is that many times people will learn parts and they get together and they're listening to themselves play the parts, but not listening to the other musicians in the room. And that's when you start to really learn how to gel together. And so, as you said, I think it's essential not to just learn the stuff, but to get outside of the practice room and to fall on your face with other people who are there to inspire and encourage you, because that's when things get to be fun. And I know you and I have had this conversation before, but from a jazz standpoint, one of the things that I often struggle with is I'm very comfortable in the practice room. And then when I'm in a performance situation, I start to fall back into I think I'm supposed to do this and the basic fundamentals. And you tend to forego your artistic side because you feel like you have to play into the rules. And so that's one of the things that I know I've said to you before that I loved about your isms book, is it's starting to break me outside of feeling like I have to play within the rules and allowing me confidently to express myself artistically. And I know that this book on shuffles, amongst all of your other books, is going to have that impact on many people as well. And for that, I am truly grateful.
Oh, thank you. One thing too that you said is, I think a key element is to learning how to not think when you're playing and just have everything flow naturally. And I think diving into these styles and these particular feels and varieties and shuffles and really becoming comfortable with them, at least in my own experience, has allowed me to get on stage and play these shuffles and not think and just be in the moment and enjoy them and have fun. So that's always the goal, in my opinion, is to make the music and shut your brain off and just go with the flow.
And so as an educator yourself, if you're sitting with a student who's trying to learn some of these sort of fundamentals, what advice do you pass along to them to try and get them out of that rut?
Again, I still go back to just listening to the music, playing along with the music, and then recording yourself. There are also some technique exercises that I like to use with some of my students to really open up the swing feel. A lot of these exercises I got from Bruce Becker, who's a good friend and an amazing teacher. He kind of used the Freddie Gruber method. So within my shuffle teaching, I do discuss some technical aspects. So if anyone wants to take a lesson, that's one thing that we can definitely go over, because that method changed the way that I swing, and especially changed the way that I play like a double shuffle with my left hand and my right hand on the ride.
Along that lines, you have a student comes in and they want to learn shuffles, but they don't know anything about shuffles. How do you introduce the shuffle to a blank canvas student?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of my favorite shuffle recordings is Dust My Broom by Elmore James. And that has Odie Payne Jr. on the drums. And it's kind of a great medium double shuffle that's fairly driving, but it's usually a pretty comfortable tempo for people to play along with. That's one of my favorite ones, just to introduce to somebody what a shuffle is. And the fills in it are unique and interesting, and it's a killer song. So I think introducing a student to songs that they might like to listen to is the easiest way to get them into shuffle drumming. As I mentioned earlier, Jimmy Reed, I think, was one of the best songwriters, and a lot of his music I love because of the songs. And I think that's another artist that's great to introduce to people if they want to get into shuffles, because, there's a song that they like, that makes it more fun to practice, I think.
Now, would you introduce that to a student and try and get them to play along with it and get comfortable with it before you introduce the technical explanation as to what the shuffle is?
I probably would just, I would jump into some of the technical aspects for sure. Usually I think a double shuffle is a good place to start. Just hands in unison and just breaking down what's happening in terms of the triplet and where you're putting the notes. Again, it also depends on the age of the student. If this is an adult, it's a little more straightforward to explain that aspect to them. But if you're teaching like a younger student, obviously getting into like triplets and subdivisions is a little bit more complicated. And in that sense, I usually just try to give them a very basic understanding of what's happening and then let them have some fun just playing with the music. It
all comes down once again to the context of the music and to listening. And I think one of the things that I also love about your book, as you already mentioned, is that you have song references and album references. And I think for me as a student, the thing I love about stuff like that is that there's something that I'm intrigued by. I'm going to take the time to seek it out. And if you actually take the time to seek it out, whether it be find it online or go and track down the recording, you've already invested in the learning experience. Along that lines, when I was studying jazz at college, one of the most essential lessons I got from my teacher was he took a sheet of paper, he wrote down 12 records. He goes, your homework is to go buy these records. And I loved that because I would go out and I would go to record stores and I would find them and I would buy them. And if you're investing your time and your money into that, you're going to invest your time into the listening and the learning experience. And I think sometimes when you are bombarded with so much stuff these days, it's too easy just to not put the depth of time that's required to learn a lot of these things. And so I think your references in here, particularly for the certain tracks, are essential because you can explain all of the different styles, but if they don't know where to hear them, they're not really going to truly learn that particular example.
Then it's just ink. It's just ink on a page, and like you said too, like you can look at it and you're like, oh, that seems kind of straightforward. Which is why you have to listen. And also, this book is going to come with video examples, so I'm going to be playing a lot of these exercises, and you can check out the videos and see how I play them and sonically what's going on in terms of on the snare drum and on the ride, on the bass drum, and that can give you a little context as well. But context is key. Otherwise, I think you're kind of just floating around in a world of, music. And if you're trying to be true to the original art form, you need to know the history and, the region helps and the key players who were defining that style and why they were doing it. And my goal with this book is to answer those questions and lay it out in as clear a format as I could. So.
You want to learn the fundamentals. You want to learn to respect the traditions. And then once you've done that, you can add your own artistry to it. Whereas I think sometimes people bypass learn the fundamentals and respect the traditions, and they just get into the artistry, which is fine. But then it usually has some fundamentals that just don't translate as well to the other musicians on the stage.
Like Chris Layton, for example, we talked about him a little bit and his playing with Stevie Ray Vaughan. And one of the things that he did that was, or still does, that was unique and really interesting is his hi-hat foot playing. He used a lot of interesting ostinatos underneath his hands with his hi-hat foot. And there's a section in the book where I talk about how that inspired me to come up with a particular groove on my own project called Canyon Lights. There's a song called Let Me In, where I kind of use the Chris Layton hi-hat ostinato, which is like a dotted quarter note thing. And then I add some hi-hat splashes to them. And it, I think is an example of like, be inspired and learn what these people are doing, and then try to make it your own in some form.
What else is keeping you busy these days?
Parlor Greens. The organ trio that I'm in has been really busy. We just released our second album, Emeralds, which came out on Coal Mine Records. We're about to head out. We're actually doing New Orleans Jazz Fest. I'm leaving in a couple days for that. And then we're going to go out to Europe for a week. Obviously, once this episode comes out, all of these things would have occurred already. But we're keeping busy. And it's been a lot of fun playing with Adam Scone. He's the organist, and Jimmy James is the guitarist. And also we have a few songs where I get to play some shuffles. There's a song called $200 Blues where I play like a Chicago shuffle. It's a blast. So it's been great making music and going on an adventure every night with those guys.
Well, and that's one of those creative situations where you're coming from that respecting the tradition, but in an outlet where you can add your own thing and really take it to another level. And I've seen some clips of the stuff you guys are doing, and it's spectacular.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
When I spoke to you last time, we talked a lot about your isms series, the Haynes-ISM and the Philly-ISM. And then at that time, you said you were looking at some other potential additions. Is that still something that's on the up and coming list that you're considering?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I'm always, I have a few different ism books that I've started. There's probably going to be an Elvinism that I've worked on a bunch. My first goal is to get the second volume of the Shuffle book series finished. Then I'll be diving more into the isms for sure.
And have you started volume 2 yet?
I did. Well, funny enough, like as I mentioned, initially this was going to be one book, so I was already doing some volume 2 aspects, but it just turned into this beast that was way too long. So we, Hudson Music and myself, like decided to split it into 2 different volumes that'll come out. Hopefully, the volume 2, if everything goes to plan, will come out next year.
Well, I'm really looking forward to seeing where that evolves to, because as I said, it's getting into some of the more, contemporary drummers in terms of some of the LA guys who are all iconically known for their shuffle styles. You also mentioned Art Blakey, who is probably one of my favorites in terms of the jazz genre because of his power and precision. There's a lot of fire in the stuff that he does in an intensity, but he's got a monstrous shuffle within that context, so it kind of ties those 2 worlds together, and I think that's going to be spectacular as well. What else is keeping you busy?
Actually, I recently started producing some artists. There's a guitarist and singer based out of Boston named Troy Mercy. And he asked me to produce his record, which is going to be coming out, I think actually next month in May of 2026. So that was a whole different avenue and adventure to go down, just putting on the producer hat and helping, with pre-production and arranging songs. And I played drums on half the album as well. It was such a fun experience and something that I'm definitely going to continue to pursue and go, because the aspect of just making records and making music, and being in the studio and mixing, and it's one of my all-time favorite things to do. So,
well, in Boston, you were actively involved in the studio scene there. And now that you've moved to Nashville, are you starting to find opportunities or opening up in the studios there for you?
Yeah, I've done a couple of sessions here, and I have a setup too in the house that I live. Like we have a 388 tape machine and some great microphones. So I've started to do some recording here as well. I was fortunate to work with my friend AJ Fullerton, who's also a producer. He produced a session recently, and we worked with this mix engineer, Zach Allen, who has worked with Buddy Guy and Taj Mahal and Keb Mo and all sorts of blues legends. So being able to record with him was a really fantastic experience. And I'm always looking to do, more session work. And that's one of my main goals in Nashville, is to break into that a bit more.
Are you someone that enjoys the process of remote recording from an engineer side, or are you just more happy to be on the player end of things?
I definitely prefer being on the player end of things. So engineering is still new to me. Mm-hmm. And that's another goal of mine now that I have a setup, is to become more comfortable and more fluent in like that aspect. I love just going to a studio and making music and playing the role of producer or drummer. But engineer is something that I'd like to get decently good at, enough that I could record myself. But I know it's the whole art and science to that, and I respect the people who do that, and I'll let them handle that aspect of it.
I am really excited to see how this book has come together. I'm really grateful that you reached out and gave me an opportunity to take a look at a pre-release version of this. As soon as the book comes out, I will definitely be buying and promoting this book. I think your approach as an educator and the quality of the materials that you have is exceptional and essential for allowing people the opportunity to get to the next level. It's always a pleasure to connect with you, and I really look forward to, at some point, hoping to get a chance to meet in person one day. So if you ever are down my way up in Canada, let's connect in person. But when Volume 2 comes out, let's connect again and get into that.
For sure.
It's always a pleasure, and I can't wait to see what's next for you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure talking with you as well.
You've been listening to the Drummer's Pathway podcast. Please share and subscribe, get the word out, and let's keep the discussion going. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.